Have you ever wondered what would happen if one day you realized that most of the pain in your life is not an accident, nor an injustice, but a force quietly pushing you to become stronger? Most of us are taught to avoid suffering at all costs. But Friedrich Nietzsche looked at that way of living and made a cold observation. A life that is too safe often produces people who have never touched their real strength. The uncomfortable truth is this: it is not pleasure, but pressure that shapes a human being. It is not peaceful days, but the moments when everything collapses that force you to confront your real limits. And at that point, a question appears. Will this pain destroy you, or will it become your greatest strength? This video is not a positive piece of advice. It is a journey through Nietzsche's harsh logic about how suffering can be transformed into strength. From understanding the nature of pain to the moment when you begin to extract energy from that pressure to push beyond your old limits. And if you follow this journey to the end, you will begin to see pain the way Nietzsche once did. Not as an accident of life, but as the furnace where a human being's real strength is forged. Number 1. The first truth: suffering is the condition of growth. There is a truth that most people only touch after a few collisions with life. Suffering is not an accident of life, but the condition of growth. From childhood, you are taught to avoid pain, avoid mistakes, avoid conflict, avoid anything that might make you uncomfortable. Modern society has even turned this philosophy into a complete system, optimizing comfort, maximizing safety, minimizing risk. But Friedrich Nietzsche looked at this logic and pointed out something many people do not want to hear. A mind that has never endured serious pressure often remains shallow. Not because it lacks intelligence, but because it has never been forced to confront its true limits. When life is too smooth, people easily confuse stability with strength, convenience with capability, and the absence of challenge with maturity. Nietzsche once wrote in Twilight of the Idols, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." But this is not an optimistic slogan. It is a brutal truth about how life actually works. Suffering does not automatically make a person stronger. Many people are destroyed by it. But if an individual refuses to let pressure crush them, if they do not transform suffering into resentment, then that pressure can become the most powerful training force they will ever encounter. A person who has never experienced a major failure often does not know their true limits. A person who has never been forced to stand up after everything collapses often does not know how strong they can actually become. Nietzsche did not believe in a form of growth built through excessive protection. He looked at human beings like material being forged in a furnace. A raw piece of metal lying still is soft and shapeless. But when it is heated red-hot in fire, struck repeatedly by heavy blows, stretched and quenched, it begins to become a blade with a clear form. The same process happens to human beings. Difficult periods, failures, and moments when every guarantee disappears are the furnace where an individual's nature is shaped. No one enjoys this process, and many people try to avoid it. But avoiding friction also means avoiding strength. Imagine a young person entering their first job with great expectations. For the first few years, everything goes smoothly. They receive praise, recognition, and begin to believe that the path ahead is secured. But then a disruption occurs. The company restructures, and their position disappears after a short email. In that moment, the entire sense of stability they once relied on collapses. Long-term plans become meaningless. The professional identity that once gave them confidence suddenly feels empty, and a disturbing question emerges. If all of this can disappear so quickly, who am I when none of it remains? Many people react with bitterness or despair, but a small number react differently. They begin rebuilding from the ground up. They learn new skills, reconsider their path, and develop psychological resilience they had never needed before. What they lose is only the illusion of certainty. What they gain is a kind of strength that a safe environment could never teach. The problem is that people often want strength without paying the price for it. They want confidence, but not failure. They want independence, but not loneliness. They want to be different, but still receive the applause of the crowd. Nietzsche looked directly at this contradiction and rejected it. An individual who wants depth cannot remain forever inside the cushion of comfort. It is pressure that forces a person to reorganize their mind, develop discipline, and learn how to stand firm when external guarantees disappear. Therefore, suffering is not proof that life is against you. In many cases, it is a sign that life is forcing you to grow. Just as metal must pass through fire to become hardened, a human being must pass through challenges to develop inner strength. And when you begin to see harsh periods in this way, a quiet shift occurs. Suffering is no longer something to avoid at all costs, but the place where a stronger version of you is forged. Number 2, the weak reaction, turning suffering into resentment. But at the very moment when suffering appears as a test, human beings stand at a psychological crossroads that Friedrich Nietzsche believed determines the entire direction of their lives. Either transform suffering into strength or transform it into resentment. And according to Nietzsche, most people unconsciously choose the second path. When an individual does not understand the nature of suffering, they respond with a psychological state Nietzsche called resentment. This is not simply sadness or disappointment. Resentment is accumulated resentment when a person feels powerless before life, but lacks the strength to change it. Instead of confronting their own limits, they search for someone to blame. Society becomes the culprit. Other people become the cause. Circumstances become proof that they have been treated unfairly. And very quickly, the story inside their mind begins to change shape. Failure is no longer something to analyze. It becomes evidence that the world itself is wrong. Nietzsche called this process the formation of slave morality, a morality of the weak, where values are created not from strength, but from the denial of strength. He wrote On the Genealogy of Morality, "Resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values." This sentence describes a familiar mechanism of the human mind. When a person cannot act, they begin to reinterpret reality in order to reduce the feeling of failure. Instead of saying, "I am not strong enough yet," they say, "That thing was never worth pursuing." Instead of saying, "I am not ready yet," they say, "This world was already broken from the beginning." The pain does not disappear, it simply turns into long-lasting bitterness. A viewer of this channel named Daniel once shared his story. Daniel had been an ambitious sales employee at a technology company. In the early years, he believed he would rise quickly, but reality did not unfold as expected. Colleagues surpassed him, several projects failed, and eventually he was moved into a less important position. Instead of examining his skills, Daniel began changing the way he saw the entire system. He said the company was full of politics. He said successful people were only lucky or fake. This narrative repeated itself so often that it became true in his mind. What is remarkable is not that Daniel failed, but that he transformed that failure into a worldview in which he no longer needed to change anything about himself. Nietzsche would look at this situation with the cold directness that defined his thinking. Resentment is like an acid slowly corroding the human spirit. It does not destroy immediately, it destroys gradually. A person carrying resentment can continue to live and work, but their psychological energy becomes trapped in judging and comparing. Instead of building strength, they build reasons to hate those who are stronger than them. You can imagine resentment like stagnant water. When water stops flowing, it gradually becomes cloudy, then begins to smell, and eventually becomes an environment where decay grows. The original pain is like a powerful current of water. If it is allowed to flow, it can create movement and transformation. But when a person blocks that flow with resentment, the energy of suffering does not disappear. It becomes trapped in a closed space where it begins to rot the spirit of the person carrying it. For this reason, Nietzsche considered resentment the weakest response to suffering. Not because suffering makes people weak, but because resentment stops their growth. When an individual believes the world was wrong from the beginning, they have no reason to change themselves. When they believe every failure was caused by others, they also have no reason to become stronger. This is the paradox Nietzsche wanted people to see. Suffering itself does not destroy human beings. What destroys them is the way they interpret it. A person can be knocked down by catastrophe and rise stronger afterward. But a person infected with resentment will carry that failure for the rest of their life, not as a lesson, but as proof that the world has always been against them. And at this exact point, Nietzsche's real philosophical question emerges. When suffering happens, will you use it to forge strength or to nourish resentment? Because those two paths lead to two completely different kinds of human beings. One becomes sharper after every collision with life. The other only becomes more bitter. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment when a failure or loss forced you to completely change the way you see yourself? If so, share your story in the comments. Your experience might help someone else who is going through a difficult period realize that they are not the only one. Number 3, the decisive moment, reinterpreting suffering. So if suffering is not what destroys human beings, but merely the raw material of transformation, then what becomes the real question? Not how to avoid suffering, but how to turn it into strength. And according to Friedrich Nietzsche, the first step of that process is not external action, but the way you interpret your pain. Nietzsche touched a mechanism far deeper than temporary emotions. What determines the direction of life is not the event that happens to you, but the meaning you assign to that event. Two people can experience the same loss, the same failure, the same collapse, yet emerge in completely different forms. One leaves the experience feeling betrayed by the world and carries bitterness. The other leaves it with a new kind of strength, as if the pressure has opened a layer of will they had never accessed before. Not because they felt less pain, but because they used the pain differently. The difference lies in an action that seems almost invisible. The question asked inside the mind. The weak person asks, almost automatically, "Why did this happen to me?" This question may sound reasonable, but it carries a dangerous assumption. It assumes that life has done something wrong, that you deserved different treatment, that suffering is an injustice that must be explained. That question does not open strength. It only opens complaint. The strong person asks a different question. Not why, but who is this forcing me to become? This question does not search for a culprit. It searches for transformation. And this subtle change in questioning turns suffering from a sentence into a force of propulsion. In Greek mythology, there is a story that perfectly illustrates this logic: the choice of Hercules. Legend says that when Hercules was young, he stood before two paths. One promised ease, pleasure, and a life without struggle. The other promised hardship, challenge, and endless labor. Hercules did not choose the easy road. He chose the difficult one, the path that eventually led him to the famous 12 labors. The key point was not Hercules' physical strength. If he had seen each hardship as an injustice, his story would have ended at the very first trial. But by accepting suffering as the price of greatness, he turned those trials into the furnace in which he was remade. This may sound like pure philosophy, but modern science has begun touching the same logic. In neuroscience and psychology, research on cognitive appraisal shows that the same stressful stimulus can trigger two different biological responses depending on how an individual interprets it. If the brain interprets the experience as an uncontrollable threat, the nervous system enters a state of depletion. But if the experience is interpreted as a challenge that can be confronted, that same pressure activates adaptive systems that increase focus, endurance, and learning capacity. In other words, the way you understand pain determines whether it destroys you or strengthens you. Nietzsche saw this principle long before neuroscience existed. He wrote a sentence that is both cold and extremely precise. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. When a person has a strong enough why, they can endure almost any how of life. This statement is not comfort, it is a warning. If you do not create meaning for your suffering, your mind will automatically interpret it in the weakest way possible, as proof that life has turned against you. And this is the decisive moment Nietzsche spoke about. If you interpret suffering as injustice, it becomes resentment. But if you treat it as a challenge forcing you to grow stronger, it becomes fuel for inner power. Suffering does not become pleasant in this process. Nietzsche never promised that, but he pointed to something far more dangerous. Suffering can become a tool for creating strength. And this shift in interpretation is the first step in turning your pain into your greatest resource. Number 4. The will to power, the hidden energy behind suffering. If suffering can be reinterpreted as a challenge rather than a sentence, then the next step in Nietzsche's logic is even harsher. You must understand what real energy lies behind it. Because according to Nietzsche, beneath every feeling of anxiety, stagnation, or crisis, there always exists a fundamental force of life that he called the will to power, the will to expand the strength of life itself. Human beings often believe they live in pursuit of happiness, safety, or balance. But Nietzsche argued that these are only surface motivations. At a deeper level, life always seeks to increase its capacity, to surpass its present limits, to become more than it currently is. When this expansive force is suppressed for too long by habit, fear, or structures that have become too small, pressure begins to accumulate. And that pressure is what human beings usually experience as suffering. If suffering is a sign that the will to power has been restrained, then this implies a difficult truth. Many of the pains in life do not come from weakness, but from living below your potential. A part of your inner strength has grown beyond the old form of your life, but you continue to maintain the old structure because it feels familiar. That gap creates tension, like a muscle held still for too long. Strength does not disappear, it simply transforms into frustration. Think about the story of Anna. For many years, every weekend she returned home to have dinner with her family. Each dinner followed the same familiar script. Relatives offered comments about her life, from her clothing to her personal decisions. Anna always stayed silent. She smiled, changed the topic, or nodded to avoid tension. But after every dinner, she left with a strange heaviness, as if a part of herself had just been suppressed again. Until one evening when a familiar criticism appeared once more, and for the first time Anna did not remain silent. She calmly said that she would not accept being spoken to that way. The table immediately became tense. Some relatives felt uncomfortable, and the atmosphere grew heavier than before. But when Anna left the house that night, she noticed something unusual. For the first time in many years, she felt light. The pain she had carried was not because she was too sensitive, but because her personal strength had been compressed for too long. You can imagine this process like a river blocked by a dam. When the current is restrained, pressure builds behind the barrier and the surface becomes chaotic. But once the dam opens, that same water immediately becomes an enormous driving force. The water has not changed its nature. What changes is the direction in which it flows. Suffering works the same way. It is not merely a negative emotion, but the energy of life when it has been compressed. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." Inside every human being exists a kind of energy that has not yet taken form. When that energy is suppressed by fear or by social patterns, it becomes a crisis. But when it is directed into action, discipline, and the expansion of the self, that same chaos becomes the origin of strength. So when Nietzsche speaks of the will to power, he is describing the ability of life to overcome itself. And in that process, suffering often functions as a signal that the old structure of life has become too small. When you begin to see pain this way, a reversal occurs. Instead of merely enduring it, you begin extracting energy from it. In that process, pain slowly loses its role as a destroyer and becomes fuel for development. Nietzsche did not promise that this process would be easy, but he revealed a truth that few people want to face. Life always seeks to become stronger, and if you accept that pressure as part of growth, the same force that once pushed you into crisis can become the most powerful engine of your transformation. And that is how suffering can become your greatest strength. If you recognize a part of your own experience in this journey, press like on the video. Sometimes even a very small action is enough to remind yourself that the pressures that once pushed you into crisis can become the starting point of a stronger version of yourself. Number 5. Self-overcoming. If suffering truly is the compressed energy of the will to power, then the next question becomes clearer. How can that energy become real strength? Nietzsche gives a blunt and harsh answer. It happens only when a person learns to overcome themselves. Because according to Nietzsche, the greatest enemy of a human being is not circumstance, nor the people who oppose them. The greatest enemy is always their old version of themselves, the familiar, comfortable version, but smaller than their true potential. That is why real strength does not lie in defeating others, but in breaking one's own limits. Nietzsche calls this process self-overcoming. Self-overcoming is not a moment of inspiration. It is a ruthless process in which a person repeatedly forces themselves to step out of the patterns that once protected them. When someone faces suffering without turning away and running, when they refuse to retreat into resentment or self-pity, they are doing something far deeper than merely enduring. They are breaking an old limit within themselves, and each time that happens, their psychological structure changes. A part of the old self dies so that a stronger part can be born. This can be seen very clearly in the story of Nelson Mandela. When he was sentenced to prison and sent to Robben Island, Mandela did not only lose his freedom, he was cut off from his family, from political life, from the future he had been building. In the early years in prison, the hard labor, isolation, and cruelty of the prison system could easily turn a person bitter. In such conditions, the most common reaction is resentment. But Mandela chose another path. Instead of letting prison shrink him, he used that time to forge his will. He read books, studied law, observed people, and most importantly, he learned to control his own emotions. When he finally walked out of prison after 27 years, what astonished the world was not only his endurance, but the fact that he did not emerge with hatred. Mandela did not merely survive suffering, he overcame the version of himself that could have been destroyed by it. That process of self-overcoming is what turned a political prisoner into a symbol of spiritual strength. Nietzsche once wrote, "Man is something that shall be overcome." This line is often misunderstood as a denial of human value, but what Nietzsche meant is far deeper. He believed that the human being is not a finished state. The human being is a process, and that process moves forward only when an individual continually overcomes themselves. This is precisely the point where suffering begins to change its role. When you see life through the lens of self-overcoming, suffering is no longer merely an experience to be endured. It becomes a tool for breaking old structures within yourself. Each challenge forces you to reorganize the way you think, the way you act, and the way you see yourself. And through that process, a stronger version of you is gradually formed. Nietzsche points to a ruthless law of life. Strength appears only when a person is willing to overcome themselves. And the paradox is that the most painful moments are often where that process begins. When you refuse to be confined by pain, when you use it to force yourself to grow beyond old limits, you are doing what Nietzsche considered the essence of maturity, turning suffering into the driving force of self-overcoming. And through that process, what once threatened to destroy you slowly becomes your greatest source of strength. This is how pain is transformed, not by denying it, and not by waiting for it to disappear, but by using it as a pressure that forces you to become stronger than who you were yesterday. And when this process repeats long enough, you begin to see what Nietzsche saw very early on. Suffering is not something to remove from life, but the raw material from which the greatest human strength is made. Number 6. Amor Fati, loving your fate. When a person has learned how to overcome themselves, Nietzsche's philosophy pushes them even farther toward an attitude that at first sounds almost cruel. Not only enduring suffering, not only using it to become stronger, but learning to accept and love the very fate that created it. Nietzsche called this attitude Amor Fati, love of one's fate. This does not mean glorifying suffering in a romantic way or surrendering in resignation. It is a reversal in how one sees life. Instead of wishing painful events had never happened, a strong person begins to see them as necessary links in the process of creating themselves. Nietzsche understood that most people live with a quiet resistance toward the past. They accept their present, but they always carry a what if. What if I hadn't failed that time? What if that person hadn't left me? What if that event hadn't happened? But for Nietzsche, that attitude is precisely what keeps a person weak. Because when you continue to fight the past, you are also fighting the very person the past has created. Amor Fati begins at the moment you realize that every suffering you have lived through is not only something that happened to you, but part of the process that formed you. And when that understanding becomes deep enough, your attitude changes. You no longer merely endure your fate, you begin to accept it as part of your strength. A practical example of this attitude can be seen in the story of Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps. In the harshest conditions a human being can imagine, where hunger, loss, and death became everyday realities, Frankl realized a truth that astonished many. Even in the most horrific circumstances, a person still retains one final kind of freedom, the freedom to choose their attitude toward what happens. After the war, when he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl did not deny the pain of the past, but he also did not see it as a meaningless chapter of his life. Those years forced him to confront the deepest question of existence: what makes a person continue living even when everything around them has collapsed? Instead of wishing that past had never existed, Frankl turned it into the foundation of his entire body of thought. The suffering did not disappear, but it was transformed into a kind of understanding he would never have gained if his life had been easier. You can imagine Amor Fati like the way a sculptor looks at a rough block of stone. To an impatient person, the cracks in the stone are flaws to be removed. But to a true artist, those very cracks suggest the shape of the statue within. He does not try to erase them, he uses them to shape the work. Human life is the same. Painful events are often the cracks in the structure of a life. But it is through those cracks that a new form of the human being can emerge. Nietzsche expressed this spirit with the sentence, "My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity." This is not comfortable advice, it is a philosophical challenge. Because to truly accept every event in your life, including the most painful ones, a person must reach a rare kind of inner strength. And it is precisely here that pain completes its process of transformation. At first it appears as a wound, then it becomes a test, then it becomes fuel for growth. But when a person reaches Amor Fati, suffering is no longer merely a tool to overcome. It becomes part of the story they are willing to carry without regret. When that happens, a strange freedom appears. You are no longer trapped in the question, Why did this happen to me? Because you understand that those very things helped create the person you are becoming. And that is a very far step in Nietzsche's logic of turning suffering into strength. Not only using it, not only overcoming it, but accepting the entire journey that created it. When a person can say yes, even to the darkest chapters of their life, they are no longer a victim of the past. They become the author of their own life. If you have ever lived through an event you once only wanted to forget, but now are beginning to see that it helped create who you are today, try writing one word in the comments. Amor Fati. Sometimes one word like that is also how you acknowledge something profoundly Nietzschean. Your past is not something to erase, but part of the strength being formed within you. Number 7. Revaluation of values. And when a person has gone so far that they can say yes, even to the most difficult chapters of their life, one final transformation begins to appear. Suffering does not only change their strength, it forces them to change the entire value system they once used to understand the world. Friedrich Nietzsche called this process the revaluation of values. When suffering goes deep enough, it does not only injure emotion, it shatters the beliefs a person once relied on to define their life. What once seemed certain begins to collapse, and the standards once considered right begin to reveal their shallowness. At that moment, a dangerous question appears. If the values I was taught are no longer enough to explain life, then what will I live by? Most people avoid this question by returning to old value systems. They try to patch up the cracked belief to keep living inside what feels familiar. But Nietzsche believed a truly strong individual would do the opposite. They stare directly at that collapse and understand that this is not only loss, it is a rare opportunity to create their own values. I once heard the story of a woman named Maria. She married very young, and for nearly 20 years after that, her life revolved around family. Each day repeated the same familiar rhythm: preparing breakfast, caring for the children, keeping the house tidy, and trying to please everyone in order to avoid conflict. But when the marriage ended in an unexpected divorce, that entire familiar structure of life vanished immediately. Silent dinners in an empty house made Maria realize something uncomfortable. For many years, she had lived more by what she should do than by what she truly wanted. After a long period of struggle, Maria began changing very small things. She decided for herself how she would live, made time for things that had always been postponed, and no longer tried to be the version others expected. The divorce had once made her believe her life had collapsed. But from that point on, Maria, for the first time, rebuilt her life based on her own choices. Nietzsche believed that most people live by values inherited from society. What success is, how important reputation is, what is considered a good life. But when an individual passes through major events, they begin to realize that many of those values do not actually belong to them. They are only patterns passed down from the crowd. Nietzsche expressed this spirit with a famous sentence: "He who cannot obey himself will be commanded." Someone who cannot set law for themselves will always have to live under the law of others. When you do not create your own value system, you will live by values imposed by society, family, or the crowd. And when those values collapse, your life collapses with them. But if you are courageous enough to see that collapse as an opportunity, a new possibility appears. You begin asking questions you never dared to ask before. what truly matters to me, what is worth devoting an entire life to pursuing, what is only an illusion repeated long enough to look like truth. Through that process, an individual begins building their own value system, not the one taught from childhood or applauded by society, but one formed from their own experience. And when a person begins living by the values they themselves create, a different kind of strength emerges. They no longer need the crowd's confirmation to know they are on the right path. This is the point where the title of this journey reaches its deepest meaning. Turning suffering into strength is not only about becoming more resilient. It is the process in which suffering shatters old illusions, forces you to confront yourself, and ultimately helps you create a value system strong enough to guide your life. And when that happens, suffering is no longer your enemy. It becomes the harshest teacher you have ever had. Because through it, you learn what Nietzsche saw as the core of maturity. Not only living inside a world created by others, but daring to become the creator of values for your own life. At this point, if what you have just heard makes your heart feel a little heavier and a little clearer at the same time, then you are touching exactly what Friedrich Nietzsche always wanted people to face. Because the day you realize suffering is not an accident of life, nor proof that the world has turned against you, that is the day a great illusion begins to collapse. And when that illusion falls, another possibility opens. Your pain is no longer only a wound, it becomes the raw material of strength. And gradually, you will understand what Nietzsche saw very clearly. Strength does not appear on peaceful days. It is formed not through one heroic, dazzling moment, but through small choices repeated in silence. Standing up after failure, refusing resentment, using pressure to grow, and step by step turning pain into inner strength. If this video makes you look back at your pain in a different way, share it with someone else who also needs to hear this. And if you want to continue exploring Nietzsche's deep ideas about strength, freedom, and self-overcoming, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Because sometimes, a new way of understanding pain is enough to change the entire way you live the rest of your life.